This episode is brought to you by Progressive, a leader in boat insurance. Welcome aboard to Carefree Boating. Here, we don't worry about the what-ifs, because we explore with Progressive Boat Insurance for as little as $100 per year for a basic liability policy. Progressive also offers a variety of other coverages and can help you cover repair costs when you need it. And with discounts like multi-policy, safety courses, responsible driver, and more, your mind can really float free. Cruise on over to Progressive.com to get a quote today and see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Rate and discounts not available in all states or situations.
We'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thank you.
Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot Sunday School, the weekend comb-over to our midweek fake tan. I'm Andreou.
And I'm Arthur Snell.
Surprising, isn't it, listeners? I inopportuned poor Arthur in the middle of a family break away to convince him to chat to us, seeing as all the big events this week seem to be taking place very much in his backyard. How are you, Arthur?
I'm very well. Joining you from lovely Strasbourg. I'm towards the end of a wonderful family holiday, but to be very frank, I'm not very good at switching off the news and all the rest of it. So it's no hardship at all.
On this week of all weeks, it won't have been easy, but at least we are talking at sort of some god-awful hour early in the morning, so that at least you get the day clear with the family after chatting to me.
Indeed.
Now, the reason Arthur is here, obviously, as you may have guessed, is because there is one big topic today, and that is the much-anticipated meeting between the big cheese and the big blini. One can only speculate, of course, but at least with Arthur here, the speculation is considerably more educated.
I don't know about that. But anyway, before we get started, please do sign up to support Quiet Riot at ko-fi.com/quietriotpod. Supporters get access to our Discord channel, live editorial meetings, Ask Us Anything shows, and lots more.
And for more deep dives on all things foreign policy, including Ukraine, Gaza, and Sudan, do also subscribe to Arthur's superb podcast, Behind the Lines, and his Substack. Links for both are in the show notes.
Okay, let's get cracking, Alex.
Quiet Riot.
On Friday, Vladimir Putin, vovy to his friends, took a brief break from riding bears to humiliate the President of the United States. In an untypically unsavvy move, Trump went out on a limb before the summit to say what he wanted out of it, a ceasefire. This gives a very clear yardstick by which to measure the result, which is, well, not a ceasefire. Arthur, the world watched and waited and waited and waited, and in the end, not only did we not get any deal, but we got no detail of anything that had been discussed, or indeed were able to ask any questions. The journalist, I think, that travelled so many hours to Alaska, I think people failed to appreciate just how many hours is a trip from Washington to Alaska.
Yeah.
They looked annoyed at not being able to ask any questions. And Trump looked pissed off to me. What did you make of it?
Well, he certainly didn't have much to crow about, did he? I mean, I think your point at the top there, Alex, about Trump saying he needed a ceasefire, I had assumed, I saw this as an easy victory for Putin in the sense that Trump inviting Putin to Alaska with all these resonances of Russian history and all the rest of it, and inviting him one-on-one, excluding Zelensky, that was already the victory before Putin had even touched down. But what I hadn't imagined was that they wouldn't even come up with a kind of fake ceasefire that at least would allow Trump to say that he'd got something from the meeting. So it really was Putin rubbing Trump's face in the fact that in the weird dynamic of their relationship, we know who daddy is.
Mm. He's still a sort of unpredictable quantity, though, Trump, I mean. And so he's not going to like being shown up like that in front of the world media. He is someone that you usually can't get to stop talking at press conferences. And so for him to say nothing pretty much He spoke second, said very little, took no questions on Air Force One, took no questions after when disembarking Air Force One. So it's a situation where he had exactly what he wanted, everyone's attention on him, but he was made to look a fool. How is he going to react to that? I mean, what's he going to be posting on Truth Social in 24 hours when he's had time to stew?
Yeah, I imagine a lot depends on what he sees when he switches on Fox News, which, as we all know, is one of the sort of guiding lights in his world. Now, unsurprisingly, even Fox News couldn't paint this in a sort of positive light for Trump. They observed the oddity of letting Putin speak first in the press conference, where Trump is the host and all the traditions and formalities assume that he would go first. And later on, there's a clip of a Fox News reporter tying herself in knots, having to acknowledge that absolutely nothing was achieved at this summit, but clearly it being the Trump propaganda channel trying to suggest that perhaps there were things that we didn't yet know. So I think what is quite likely is that as it really sinks into Trump, just what an idiot he's been made to look. And of course, the whole underlying purpose here is to have a mega distraction from the Epstein scandal that just won't go away. And so I think Trump, I would imagine, is going to get very, very cross. And then, yes, you'll probably see some unguarded comments on Truth Social. Now, whether that results in him then committing to support Ukraine or send weapons or something like that, we just don't know. Trump, his instinct is always to back Russia, but when he's made to look stupid, as in the last few weeks, he will shift himself closer to Ukraine.
I mean, the meeting took place precisely a week after his very hard secondary economic sanctions were meant to happen. The deadline for that was last Friday. And so not only did that not happen, he has been made a patsy on the international stage. Is there any way for him to backtrack to a position where he starts talking about economic sanctions again? Or is he now basically snookered, having reopened a sort of diplomatic relationship with Russia, that he can't really escalate the hostility?
I mean, I think that given, as you've rightly observed, there's no such thing as a sort of direction or a strategy. He could easily turn on a sixpence and go back to those threatened sanctions. It's interesting to note that Trump is perfectly happy to carry out threats against everybody else, whether it's the EU or Canada or whoever. But when it comes to Russia, the threats are always rhetorical rather than actual. But maybe just maybe this time, once he realizes how foolish he's been made to look, how the world imagines that Putin, has him sort of on his little finger. Maybe that will result in America finally doing what it needs to do. But it's just hard to imagine.
And Russia was in a sort of, let's call it a playful mood right from the start. I mean, from Lavrov showing up wearing an SSSR sweatshirt, the CCCP in Latin characters, the old initials of the USSR. From wearing that sweatshirt to the journalists on the plane being served chicken Kiev. I mean, Russia seemed to be openly mocking either Ukraine or the summit or both. The Lithuanian ex-foreign minister Gabrielius Landsbergis posted, "Just give us half of Ukraine and we promise we will stop," says negotiator wearing USSR sweatshirt. I mean, it's a wry point, but it's a real comment. The ultimate aim for Putin is restoring the Great Russia Empire. So anything that happens in between is just a staging post towards that for him. Will any subtext like this even register with Trump, or are we hoping that, when the five come together, or The View on Fox News, they happen to mention it and it ticks him off? Or will some officials have been whispering in his ear that it's already not looking great?
I mean, I think that on that last point, I really don't think that anyone whispers in Trump's ear, I think he literally can't receive information that is sort of given to him by someone who is perceived to be an expert who knows more about him than on a given topic. So he's happy to watch Fox News because that's a sort of dialogue, but he literally cannot envisage a scenario where the CIA Russia expert, even one who might be a MAGA supporter, comes and briefs him. That just doesn't work for him. One of the interesting things that came out of the summit, I mean, so little has come out, is that Trump handed over a letter from Melania Trump, who apparently has become quite exercised about what's happening in Ukraine, and maybe her own childhood growing up in a communist state, albeit one that was not under the thumb of Russia. Maybe this sort of stuff matters to her more. So she had written a letter to Putin about the plight of Ukrainian children who've been kidnapped and taken into Russia. And apparently, Trump has mentioned this in the past, and on other occasions, Melania Trump has talked about the bombings that Russia's doing on Ukrainian cities. Now, we might say this is all irrelevant, but I think we're in a world where you have this aging sort of autocrat, and I'm talking about Trump, not Putin, who doesn't listen to anybody. And it may be that his wife is one of the very few people that still gets through to him.
I've slowly become of the view that Melania Trump is a lot more important in this, because I think she is one of the very few people that can basically take the mickey out of Trump.
Right.
And I think she does this on the Russia issue. I think she has the capacity to sort of turn him around a little bit. As we're recording, so Zelensky says he is meeting Trump in Washington on Monday. So there was an update on Telegram just now saying that he is grateful for the invitation. We know that there was a long telephone call between Trump and Zelensky while he was on Air Force One on his way back. And then Saturday morning, there was another call with Zelensky, which was then joined by other NATO leaders. I imagine Starmer and Merz among them, and Macron. Yeah. And we now have heard that there's an invitation to Zelensky to go to Washington. What do you make of that?
Well, we have to recall that the Zelensky's first trip to Washington of this Trump presidency, resulted in a disaster and him being thrown out of the White House. And there has been a major recovery there. And it's not that Trump likes Ukraine. It's not that he's surrounded by people that like Ukraine, but we're in a very different place. And actually, this is where we need to give credit to Keir Starmer and some people in his team who saw the absolute crisis that we were in. I think it was February, wasn't it, when that meeting had occurred, and did a lot of work behind the scenes to patch things up again. So it's good that Zelensky is invited to Washington. Of course, the initial idea was the three-way meeting, and that's a failure of Trump's to put that together. And of course, if you had a powerful and incisive US president, a three-way meeting chaired by the US president might be a really effective way of drawing this war to some kind of pause, at least. But we don't have that. So we can't wish for something that isn't available. I think in a strange way, we may just be back where we were a couple of weeks ago. Now, there's so much significance freighted with a summit in Alaska, of all places, a former Russian territory, the first time that Putin comes to the United States in many years, since his sort of period of isolation. And also, this idea that it was going to bring a ceasefire in the Ukraine war. But actually, if the summit achieved nothing at all, then we are where we were, which is that Trump was slightly less anti-Ukraine, was happy for the Europeans to buy American weapons and supply those to Ukraine. And the war is where it was, let's say, about a month ago.
Okay, so is this nothing burger actually quite a good result, considering how much worse it could have been?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think one of the things, it's clear that Putin is very good at manipulation, particularly with Trump. But he's not brilliant, because he won't take wins when he's offered them. He's been offered the win by Trump and his people, particularly Steve Witkoff, Trump's negotiator. He's been offered a win numerous times and he can't take it. And I think that's partly because his own sort of, mental cloud is the idea that Ukraine exists in any form at all. And he's sort of self-radicalized to the point where he has to wipe it off the map, but he doesn't have the resources to do that. So whenever he's offered, which he has been clearly, he's been offered those eastern parts of Ukraine that are currently under Russian occupation. And clearly it would be a disaster if that were to happen. But from a Russian perspective, that would be quite a victory to seize such a huge part of territory, including territories that have, mineral wealth and other attractions. But he won't take the win. So, yes, I think this is actually both Trump and Putin have showed their kind of lack of tactical nous. And they both ended up empty-handed, really.
Their respective flaws, basically, were in the foreground, weren't they? And I found it interesting that one of the very few things Trump said in that presser after the conversation, which, as I understand it, ended slightly earlier than expected.
I think that's right. And the fancy lunch that was planned, was shelved. So clearly, behind closed doors, things must have gone quite badly to shift in that way.
Yeah. And sort of Trump hinted at a three-way meeting next involving Ukraine. And the Kremlin, via Yuri Yushakov that evening, issued a statement saying no such meeting had even been discussed, which again feels like a bit of a rebuke, a bit of a slap to Trump.
Yeah. And you have this thing that with Trump is obviously, the last person you would ever trust. I think even if you're a supporter of Trump, the last person you'd trust on what happened in a meeting behind closed doors would be Donald Trump. Trump is claiming that Putin told him that the 2020 election was hacked, was rigged, sorry. And of course, maybe Putin did do that because Putin knows how to play with Trump's brain.
Sure.
But it seems pretty unlikely that actually Putin would have just sort of gone in with that. But you just don't know. And equally, does Trump hear what he wants to hear? So that he thinks that he's got a three-way summit in the bag because he thinks he's a master negotiator. And actually, the Kremlin are just happy to play with him.
Yeah, and also you have, we saw Putin confirm this notion that had Trump been president, this war would never have started, which is, of course, bullshit because this war effectively started in 2014 and was always going to go on. Are they misjudging Trump, the Russians? Because right now I'm left with two options, right? Either the compromat is that good that they can take the piss out of him on the international stage and not care, or they are making a misjudgment. And I saw the Russian delegation and I saw how much of it was economic rather than defense, senior, tactical oriented.
Yeah.
And that hinted to me that Russia thought they can dangle, big money deals for the Americans in front of him, or maybe personally for him, and sort of turn him over that way. But the last few times I've listened to Trump, I'm beginning to think he actually does want a ceasefire. It has become the only thing that he can now present as a win to the world. He might then walk away and say, well, look, I tried my best. I engineered a ceasefire where everyone thought it was impossible, but these two just can't talk to each other. But he has maneuvered himself in a situation where anything except a ceasefire looks like failure. And Putin is not giving him that. He's not giving him even the sort of, the Potemkin appearance of that he can somehow sell. Trump comes out of every single summit and sells pretty much everything that's happened as a huge victory. So for him to have nothing to sell as a victory coming out of this, it must have been really bad.
I agree. And there was lots of pre-briefing, which I'm sure you saw, Alex, where there was talk of how this summit was going to go much further than just the war. And there were big mineral deals and economic plans and, all the stuff that has become a sort of feature of this second Trump presidency. And none of that came through. So something went wrong. And I think it comes back to what you were saying, that there is this sort of abusive relationship. It seems strange to talk about Trump as a victim of an abusive relationship, given no doubt he's perpetrated plenty of those. But there's this sort of abusive relationship between Putin and Trump. And again, is it the compromat? My own view is it's a form of political compromat, that Trump believes that his 2016 election got over the line thanks to Russian support, and he can't live with that. That's my theory, But like many abusive relationships, the abuser can overplay their hand if they want something to sustain, and then the person you're abusing loses their rag, lashes out, pulls away, gathers a bit of independence. Again, it may be bizarre to talk about Trump in this way because he's such a ghastly character, but it seems to me that this is the nature of it. So the Russians overplayed their hand, their kind of disrespectful, mocking approach. And we know from, for example, Fiona Hill, who was, Trump's Russia advisor in the first presidency, a Russia expert of considerable renown, that in meetings in Russian, Putin is sort of being sarcastic and kind of making fun of Trump in a way that obviously Trump doesn't speak Russian, but you don't have to be a speaker of a language to pick up if someone is kind of, the tone is disrespectful. So I imagine that, in Trump's very clouded brain, let's not forget he's an elderly man who is clearly very tired and not the sharpest tool in the box anyway. So somewhere in that brain, he knows that he's being sort of played around with, but he can't really deal with that.
Yeah.
So I think there must be a huge amount of kind of confusion swirling around in there.
Quiet riot.
Now, this episode is sponsored by Shopify.
Why Shopify? Well, when we started Quiet Riot, there was so much we had to figure out on our own. Even though we'd both got plenty of experience appearing on podcasts, starting our own from scratch threw up a lot of challenges, from finding studios and designing logos to wrestling with contracts and dealing with platforms.
And on a show like this, the to-do list, I can assure you, is never, ever done, and getting help is essential. Otherwise, the process of creating the show can drain the joy of putting out a podcast that we are so proud of.
For some challenges, that means reaching out to friends who can point us in the right direction, hopefully with a smile and an encouraging pat on the back. But for others, you just need the right tool for a particular job.
For millions of businesses, one of those tools is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands like ours just getting started. As we're developing our thinking about Quiet Riot branded merchandise, Shopify was the first name that came to mind to manage the whole process for us.
It's straightforward enough to get started with your own design studio. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Shopify can help you build a beautiful online store to match your brand's style.
It can accelerate your content creation too. Shopify is packed with helpful tools that help you write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography.
Plus, you can get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you. It's easy to create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are, scrolling or strolling.
Best of all, Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and more. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify.
So turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your £1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.co.uk/quietriot. Go to shopify.co.uk/quietriot. That's shopify.co.uk/quietriot.
Quiet riot.
Coming back to the actual situation on the ground, the considered view seems to be that we are still broadly in stalemate situation, although Russia is making very, very slow gains. But what I've seen presented in the last few days is this notion that, Russia could have somehow taken all of Ukraine, but it's holding back for some reason. Is that realistic in any way?
No, I don't really buy that. I think what's happened is that Russia, as you rightly say, has continued to sort of grind onwards and is fighting effectively Soviet tactics, albeit enabled with modern tech, drones, and so on. What is also perhaps emerging is that the former Ukrainian commander Zelensky, who of course is now the Ukraine's ambassador in London, and bluntly was removed from his post by Zelensky, who saw him as a political rival. Zelensky's approach was more dynamic, more reliant on a sort of tech-enabled warfare. And the Ukrainian military, since Zelensky's departure, has not really performed at the same level. Now, there are loads of factors in that, and a lot is that Ukraine's military clearly is fighting a war for survival. It's had interruptions in the supplies from the West. There's all kind of aspects to this. But the basic point is still, I think you're right, that you've got a sort of stalemate with a very slow Russian advance. But the basic point is that you have a war of attrition in which one side, Russia, has many, many, many more men that it can throw at the problem, and also has a political structure, extreme authoritarianism, which allows it to expend maybe millions of young men, where Ukraine doesn't have that. And so that always presents us with some really, worrying long-term trajectories. And the only way around this is if sustained economic pressure can force Russia off the battlefield. And from what I've seen so far, the sanctions don't do that. Oil is the easiest thing in the world to sell by evading sanctions, and we've seen it. We know all kinds of examples in recent history. So, absent any serious role being played by the Americans, really, it's hard to see a kind of game-changing moment in this conflict.
Although I have to say that also reading between the lines from, something that Putin said in that press conference, which is that he hoped European leaders wouldn't act to torpedo this good progress, and other statements that I've seen from the Kremlin in the last few months. I think Russia has also been a little bit surprised and quite annoyed by the way in which Europe has stepped up and stepped into that gap left by the USA, and actually, of late has put its money where its mouth was. That seems to me to have surprised the Russian leadership a little bit.
Yeah, I think you're right. And actually, maybe one could say that Russia had every reason to underestimate Europe given the history.
Yeah.
But Finland and Sweden in NATO, the huge advance in defense spending, and also Ukraine becoming itself a really significant manufacturer of weapons, both for Ukraine, but also for the rest of Europe, potentially. And so all of that is an example of a sort of lack of strategic sort of insight on Putin's side. I just wanted to go back to one thing that you mentioned about, what is it that Trump wants? I think this thing about the Nobel Peace Prize, again, it's rather like when Trump first started talking about Greenland back in the first presidency, everyone thought it was a bit of a joke. I thought it was a bit of a joke that he wanted it, and it was just because Obama had it. But apparently he's obsessed with this idea, and he's been ringing up Norwegian politicians to tell them that he deserves it. So however utterly bizarre the idea of Trump wanting, that's the thing.
It really is fascinating. We had Emily Thornberry on the show about 8 months ago now, before Trump had actually been inaugurated. And it's exactly what she said. She said, he's an impossible person to deal with, but he does have his pressure points.
Yeah.
He does have, flattery works for him. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize. So that's the stuff that you can kind of use to bring him round to seeing what you want the outcome to be the same as what he wants the outcome to be. And I think actually the European leaders, and especially Keir Starmer, have done an incredible job in keeping him vaguely on side after that first disastrous meeting with Zelensky. I wanted to ask you one last thing. By the way, we now have a bit more detail from Zelensky. I say detail, there's actually no detail in the statement about anything discussed or anything agreed, but it's a sort of very warm statement. He says he had a long and very meaningful conversation with Trump, and that obviously all the stuff about being very grateful to America for its help and for trying to get this resolved, and but also repeating this idea that reliable security guarantees are absolutely necessary for anything going forward. So both sticking by his guns, but also I would be not happy if I were in the Kremlin reading this statement. It does seem like Trump is still vaguely with Team Europe. I know that would have been a ludicrous thing to say about any US president at any point in the last 100 years, but there we are.
And I guess, if Putin had won, Trump would have come out of the meeting in Alaska saying, Vladimir has done an amazing thing and he's agreed a ceasefire. Yeah. And, those Ukrainians have been cheating us and the NATO people have been stealing from us. None of that did happen. So this isn't a sort of, a 5-0 victory for Putin. There you have Zelensky on his way to Washington. There is this sense that maybe it will sink in on Trump that he has been made to look very stupid. Yeah. And Zelensky has never made him look stupid, and nor has Keir Starmer or any of the other people.
Yeah. No, it's a 1-0 victory that the Russians rather over-celebrated, it feels like, in a way that maybe has motivated their opponent. I wanted to ask you one last question. I've been increasingly annoyed by the way British media seem to platform Putin proxies. I mean, people like Sergei Markov, he was on Sky News for a big chunk yesterday, live. They're not even filtering them in any way. It just gets 10 minutes to shout about denazification of Ukraine and how it's not really a country and all that. And I know we're not legally, formally at war with Russia. We haven't legally, formally actually been at war with anyone since the mid-40s. But, when we were at war with Iraq, you didn't have the Ayatollah appearing on Sky News or BBC Radio 4 every 5 minutes to give their side of the story. It just seems really, really weird to be platforming Kremlin disinformation in our national news media in the hope of some sort of balance. I mean, a balance between what? Russia is poisoning people in our streets. What is going on? Is there something I'm not getting?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. I mean, you would hardly have, we'll go live now to the Islamic State spokesman, who'll talk you through their beheading policy. Quite often, the Russians will field someone whose job title is not Russian Minister of Information, but it might as well be. And the point is, that they're Kremlin proxies. They speak perfect English. They're extremely aggressive, but they're described as an academic or a member of a think tank or a parliamentarian.
Sergei Markov to a T.
If the BBC or Sky News said, we're now going to go direct to, Kremlin mouthpiece who is paid this many rubles a month and has properties in Monaco and whatever, perhaps that would be a bit different. But they don't do that. They treat them as if they're a sort of legitimate voice. I mean, I think this is part of a massive topic, isn't it, about disinformation, about the way that Russia takes structures that work in a certain way, such as news media, and then twists them such that they function to spread.
Yeah, it uses our liberalism against us.
Exactly. Yeah. I imagine they tell themselves, they pat themselves on the back and say, oh, we gave him a really rough ride there. But it feels to me a little bit like, the depressing phenomenon of Nigel Farage being on Question Time sort of every other week. And you search for years for a member of the Green Party or whatever. I think there's this thing about live broadcast TV where, having an angry person shout is seen as good content. And even though you and I could probably be having this conversation with some, very smart producer at Sky News, on the day when they've got 24 hours to fill, they end up booking these people because they know that person will talk uninterrupted and create good TV, so to speak, which of course is really bad news, but that's what it is.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it comes down to them covering this sort of occasion as if it were a royal wedding. You know, we're just waiting for something to happen, so we're going to fill time. And, you know, it's not a fucking royal wedding. It's a war where thousands of people are dying every day. So put your big boy pants on and start behaving like you are the national media. Anyway, that's just my little pet peeve.
Quiet riot.
Now, this is a paid advertisement from BetterHelp. Thanks to them for sponsoring today's show. If there's something that's not in short supply these days, it's opinions and advice. Heck, it's what this show majors in. Who should I vote for? What coffee maker should I use? How do I stop AI taking my job away? It can all be a bit overwhelming, and if you're looking for advice on something as serious as mental health, it really is important to find advice you can really trust. Poor mental health can be utterly debilitating, and getting trustworthy support is, I think, the essential first step in trying to turn things around, whether you've experienced major trauma or are just struggling a bit with life's daily challenges. So, how do you cut through all the noise? Well, that brings us to BetterHelp, which, as well as having more than 5,000 therapists in the UK, is also the world's largest online therapy platform, having served more than 5 million people. It's popular, an App Store rating of 4.9 out of 5 tells its own story, and BetterHelp makes it incredibly easy to fit therapy into your busy life. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/quietriot. That's betterhelp.com/quietriot.
Quiet riot.
Meanwhile, another conflict that Trump was going to end within moments of coming into power is not only still going, but considerably intensifying. Israel is moving to a position to occupy Gaza. Remember, that's the thing everyone said a year ago was never going to happen because it was completely unsustainable. So I thought we would take advantage of having Arthur available and find out what's going on there. More depressing topics, I'm afraid, Arthur. So what's the sort of the Cliff's notes of what's going on currently between Gaza and Israel?
There's the situation on the ground, which I think people are very clear about now, is a full-scale starvation situation, which has been engineered by the Israeli government in the combination of blocking most aid and then setting up this non-functional GHF, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has a very tiny number of distribution points, which then creates these huge crowds of desperate, hungry people, and more than 1,000 have been shot by Israeli army at these situations. So that's the day-to-day starvation, extreme desperation, people being shot whilst they're trying to get food. And then at the sort of strategic level, Netanyahu, yes, his plan now is to take full control of Gaza, and he's claiming that this is in order to defeat Hamas once and for all. Now, what we need to understand is that his military commanders think this is a terrible idea, and also the defeat of Hamas. You know, what is the defeat of a ideological movement that is also a terror group? A group of retired Israeli security officials, by definition, these are not wet liberals, wrote a letter to Netanyahu saying that Hamas no longer poses a strategic threat to Israel. And that's easy to imagine. You know, Gaza barely exists now. It's a patch of land covered in rubble and starvation. And of course, there will be one or two people who maybe can fire very ramshackle rockets into Israel. And I'm not denying that creates fear and alarm for Israelis. But the idea that is a strategic threat to Israel is nonsense. So why is Netanyahu doing this? I think ultimately because in order to keep his coalition going, he needs to lean right into the fullest and most extreme version of the kind of right-wing Israeli view of the Palestinians, which is that they have to be got rid of altogether. And this is where we get to the argument about genocide. Now, we're not going to, I don't think we'll solve that on this podcast, but wiping Gaza off the map is effectively the objective here. And what we also know is that Israel sent a delegation to South Sudan to discuss the possibility of relocating Palestinians to that country, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, itself racked by civil war and instability. So the South Sudanese have denied this, but the sourcing of these reports is very strong, and it's been reported to credible outlets, including CNN. It seems very clear that the ultra-hard line in the Israeli government is the one that has the upper hand, and Netanyahu himself seems completely signed up to this.
That letter by, I think, over 700 former defense, security, and intelligence officials, I mean, it included two former prime ministers, both of them like hard right, nationalist prime ministers, not quite as hard right as the hard right has moved to Israel now, but by standards, 10, 20 years ago, right-wing nationalist people, certainly. Is there now any path forward with America seemingly having just stepped back from the whole thing and saying, they appear to have put Gaza in the too difficult pile? Is there any alternative sort of plan for a ceasefire? Is anyone taking over the negotiations? I know that some of the Saudi Peninsula states had been a little bit involved as intermediaries. Is anyone taking the potential for a negotiated settlement forward, or is that simply not happening at the moment?
Well, my understanding is that the negotiations are still ongoing in Qatar. One might imagine that it's just possible there could be some way in which perhaps one or two more hostages are released. That maybe buys time, because whilst Netanyahu is definitely in the pockets of the extreme right, the general population of Israel is very much more focused on the hostages than they are on this kind of wiping Gaza off the map. What's odd about the extreme right in Israel is that they've lost interest in the hostages. It's not impossible, but I think it's extremely unlikely. And I think the other issue that you have is, so in reaction to the flurry of state recognition, obviously France sort of led the way, becoming the first G7 country to announce its plan to recognize Palestinian state, UK, Canada, others following along. The Israelis are escalating what is a decades-long operation of settlements in the West Bank, which of course is the larger chunk of land of any possible Palestinian state. Now, the West Bank is already, if people look at the maps, it's already a complete sort of Swiss cheese of Israeli settlements constantly expanding, designed with the purpose of making such a state impossible. But now they're accelerating this, and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, of course, is one of these sort of extremists in the government. He was crowing about their plan to bury a Palestinian state with a new settlement that has been is a sort of particularly key bit of land that would make such a state unworkable. So that's the other element of this, that in addition to the Gaza sort of full control, you have this desire to effectively wipe off the map the idea of a Palestinian state just at the moment that it might get recognition. Now, having said all of that, that doesn't necessarily prevent countries from going ahead and recognizing. Some people have been very dismissive of this and said, well, what difference does it make? It's just a gesture. It's not just a gesture. If we recognize a state, we, Britain, France, whoever, the relationship we have with that state changes, and the relationship we have with Israel as a country occupying a state that we recognize changes. Mm-hmm. And I think people have been too quick to dismiss this recognition point as something that has no impact.
And testament to that is the fact that none of the big G7 have done it for so many years. And are now, on the verge of doing it. If it was a nothing thing, it would have been done or not been done. Exactly. Yeah. But there is an election next year in Israel. As I understand it, the latest that can happen is October if the coalition doesn't collapse before that, or if an early election is not called. Netanyahu, after experiencing a sort of resurgence in the polls, is now going downwards again. And Naftali Bennett, himself a very hard-right politician, just not quite as nuts as Bibi, is riding very high. What could Netanyahu be hoping would change between now and then? Or is he now someone who knows he's got a year to make his sort of twisted dream scenario happen and will push on regardless?
I mean, I think he'll push on regardless, certainly. And of course, we're not talking about the domestic changes, the attempts to sort of defang the Israeli judiciary and prosecuting authorities for the specific purpose of reducing legal jeopardy to Netanyahu once he's out of power. His pursuit of a kind of retribution, a destruction of the Palestinians is partly to please those extremists in his own camp. Partly, I'm sure he has his own extreme views, but also it sits alongside these domestic changes, which, of course, as we all recall, prior to October the 7th, were the big issue in Israeli politics. As for the elections, I mean, I'm not going to try to predict at this distance, but what has consistently been the case is that whilst Netanyahu and the extreme right aren't popular, the sort of electoral math is such that they always manage to cobble together a government, whereas a kind of non-Netanyahu government, and yes, it's amazing we're in a world where Naftali Bennett looks like a sort of a relief from extremist politics, but hey, you take what you can. But that coalition, of course, Bennett was briefly a prime minister, but he couldn't hold his coalition together. So, maybe we'll have a sort of brief interregnum of a non-Netanyahu prime minister, and then Netanyahu will find some even more extreme people to persuade back into government with him. Who knows?
Quiet riot.
Now, Trump may not have ended the two wars he promised to end, but he has apparently ended on his recent UK visit. It was 4 wars. It later went up to 5, and on Friday it was 6 additional wars. He ended several of them apparently nuclear, although you wouldn't know them, they go to a different school. Sadly, one of them was not the very real war going on in Sudan. Arthur, I know you have been doing a lot of work on this for Behind the Lines, and we will leave a link in the notes. But as a primer, what are the roots of this conflict?
The war in Sudan may well be, the world's most serious humanitarian disaster at the moment. And of course, one doesn't want to play numbers games, but the number of Sudanese, about 45 million, is such that then the victims of its war are a huge number. Back in 2018, the Sudanese people rose up in a really inspiring way as a sort of late Arab Spring moment and enacted a kind of democratic revolution. This was quite quickly turned back with the backing from authoritarians in the region and further afield, countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Russia, all of whom don't like to see democracy in their backyard. The kind of instability that has existed in Sudan since that time boiled over. So in 2023, you had this conflict which has basically destroyed much of the country, and it's between the RSF, which is effectively a kind of militia private army under the command of somebody called Hemedti, and the main Sudanese National Army. Now, those two forces used to work together, but they have been at each other's throats since 2023. And the RSF receives support from the United Arab Emirates, and that in itself is rather mind-bending. The UAE, people go on holiday to Dubai. It's a sort of country, they've got their race horses in Newmarket, and we think of the UAE as one of those slightly authoritarian but basically friendly Arab states. And yet it is backing a genocidal army that has taken destruction all across Sudan. Now, when I say this about the RSF, that's not then to suggest that the Sudanese National Army is some splendid, liberal democratic force, but we have to be realistic about who these people are. And the RSF, it's worth noting, is the same force that perpetrated a genocide in Darfur in the early years of this century. So that's the background. The scale of the conflict is just terrifying. Khartoum, it's a huge city, is in ruins, and the impact actually on regional dynamics has been very interesting. So you've got Egypt allied with Turkey and Qatar, which traditionally in the recent years, they've been, again, at each other's throats. They're all on the same side, supporting the national government of Sudan. And then on the other side, you've got the United Arab Emirates supporting the RSF. So it's a big mess. But another major factor in all this is the cuts from US aid. So when Elon Musk celebrated feeding USAID into the wood chipper, killing off America's international aid program, some of the first people to suffer as a result were Sudanese. And so we're talking about starvation, desperation, displacement of more than 10 million people.
13 million at the last count, Arthur. I mean, 8 point something of that is they are displaced internally within Sudan, but that still leaves several million to neighboring countries. And this is something that I wanted to ask you about. There is hysteria in Europe at the moment over refugee movements.
Yeah.
So why are EU leaders not taking a more active interest in this conflict that is displacing millions of people with quite literally one country between them and the Mediterranean?
Yeah, I think there are various reasons. One is we're actually in an era where Europe is sort of struggling with its own sense of kind of self-belief and ability to deal with challenges on its doorstep. You've got the war in Ukraine, you've got the hideous war in Gaza. There is a degree to which Europe doesn't have the kind of diplomatic and just sort of strategic firepower to grab this thing. Previously, you would always expect America to be playing a significant role, not because it's worried about refugees from Sudan landing up in America particularly, but just because it does have that global status. Well, maybe Trump will take an interest if he can claim his Nobel Peace Prize, but otherwise he's not interested. So I think that's a factor. But I do think the role of the UAE is significant here. It's messy and very unsatisfactory, but basically most European countries have very strong economic links to the UAE. They're selling them weapons, they're banking and trading and all the other stuff. And they find it a bit difficult to tackle the war in Sudan if it means having difficult conversations with their friends in Abu Dhabi.
That's all from us today. Enjoy is never the right word for this sort of topics, but we hope at least that we left you slightly less terrified by virtue of being better informed.
Almost certainly by the time this airs, Trump will have posted on Truth Social either that he's declaring war on Russia or that he's given Alaska back.
Until then, do log on to ko-fi.com/QuietRiotPod to support this podcast and follow, rate, and review us on whatever app you use to listen.
Thank you, as always, for sharing a small part of your weekend with us. We really do appreciate it.
We love you lots. Bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Alex Andreou. Produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canelu. And edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Past, Present, Future is the History of Ideas podcast with me, David Runciman. Twice a week, we explore the history of good ideas, dangerous ideas, revolutionary ideas, and recently, the history of bad ideas. From meritocracy to genius, from austerity to identity, why do good people believe in things that do so much harm? Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast.